Okay, so first of all, thank you guys for coming very, very much. This is a lecture on stem cells, and we decided to do this because I had a rep come into the office going on about 2 months ago, talking about stem cells, and he has some before and after pictures, a little booklet, and they had everything from hair regrowth to scar rejuvenation to burns and some other stuff that's a little bit more on the medical side than the aesthetic side. I looked at the pictures and I said, "Is this real?" I couldn't believe it. And it's like, yeah, he's real. I said, what is this? And so what they were talking about is called mesenchymal stem cells, which are derived from ethically sourced umbilical cord blood that's donated from women. It goes through multiple rounds of screening for all the viruses that are out there. And once it is properly processed, it's packaged. So you get stem cells, but also the soup that stem cells grow in, what's called exosomes. So it's a combination of stem cells proper as well as exosomes, and those are different things, but they're similar and they promote tremendous growth. And I thought it was just a really amazing treatment that sort of beat anything I'd seen in the past. It's FDA approved, it's from an American company here based stateside, and we started working with it a little bit and got some great results. And so I wanted to do a lecture on what stem cells are because although most people know the term stem cell, I don't think a lot of people really understand exactly what it is. So that's the purpose of it. And so I put this together, and I'm going to try to make it accessible to people without diving into too many technical terms, because in cell biology, you get into the weeds really, really fast. So basically, think of the most complicated thing you can possibly imagine. Think of, say, the opening ceremony at the Olympics, or the climax of the orchestra of Beethoven's Ode to Joy, or Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, right? Some of humanity's greatest artistic works. These aren't even 1% of the complexity of cell biology. Cell biology is so supremely complicated. Its organization, its architecture, the amount of cellular transduction that occurs really can only be described by a single word, which is divine. And so, although the different actors of cellular biology that modulate cellular regulation are known, the actual terms are probably best left to medical school and graduate level courses, which allows us to focus more on the art of storytelling, right? So just as the Scandinavians have told stories through Norse mythology as a way of making sense of their harsh natural environment, we too are going to use allegory to discuss the principles of cell biology and cellular regulation. So my fear, what I learned in my own life early on, is that the academics through tests and exams have kind of ruined science. They've taken the fun out of science, and in doing so have camouflaged its beauty. So I think science is best shared through storytelling. And that's what we're going to do. So what is a stem cell? A stem cell is basically a young cell that is capable of two things. It's capable of self-replication, meaning it can make more of itself, and it also can differentiate into other kinds of cells. There's four kinds of stem cells: totipotent, pluripotent, multipotent, and unipotent. We're going to talk about the first three. So the best analogy for stem cells is the board game Plinko. Does anybody know what Plinko is? If you've ever seen The Price is Right, you've probably seen it. It's a great big nail board, and they have a coin on the top of it. You drop the coin, and it bounces off the nails, and you never know really what hole it's what it's going to end up in. So this is a great analogy, actually, for how stem cells work. So totipotent stem cells is the equivalent of holding our Plinko chip at the very top of the board, where it could end up with equal probability of any of the 10 receptacles at the bottom. And what totipotent cells can do is they can differentiate into any other type of cell. That's any cell within the body. It also can differentiate into the supporting cells that allow a pregnancy to come to term. Things like the placenta, the amniotic fluid, the umbilical cord. So they are truly universally stem cells. Pluripotent stem cells are the equivalent of holding the chip near the top of the board, but not quite at the top. So it might have the ability to drop into, say, 8 of the 10 different receptacles. And so pluripotent stem cells, have you heard the term embryonic stem cells? These are in the news a lot. Pluripotent, embryonic, they're one and the same. It's the same thing. And so these cells are actually not approved in the United States because they're fraught with ethical and legal questions, because you have to essentially harvest an embryo. Some people say that pluripotent stem cells are the earliest form of a human embryo. Other people say not, but the jury's still out, and therefore they're not approved in the United States. So there's something called a blastocyst. They are what's called, pluripotent stem cells come from the intercell mass of a cell called a blastocyst, which is one of the first visible signs of a pregnancy that happens on about day 5 or day 6 of post-conception. Um, and so what pluripotent stem cells can do is they can differentiate into any of the three layers of germ tissue. There are three layers in an embryo that become us. There's the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm, right? It does not include the structures of the placenta or the umbilical cord. So pluripotent stem cells can make a person, but they can't make the placenta, essentially. And so I've studied this God knows how many times, and to this day, and despite my best efforts, I still can't remember all the structures of the mesoderm, endoderm, and ectoderm, so I'm just going to read them. The endoderm becomes the GI tract and the respiratory tract, the thyroid, and parts of the urinary system. The mesoderm becomes the circulatory system, blood cells, the lymphatics, bones, cartilage, smooth muscle, ligaments, tendons, kidneys, gonads, and the adrenal glands. The ectoderm forms the nervous system, the hair, skin, the nails, and parts of the cornea. So that's the power of pluripotent stem cells. Multipotent stem cells is the next totipotent, pluripotent, multipotent. That's the equivalent of holding the Plinko chip right there, kind of at the middle of the board, where maybe it can only drop into four of the receptacles. And so they can differentiate into two types of cells. One are called hematopoietic stem cells, which means they create the cells of the blood, right? They can differentiate into any of the three cell lines, which are the red blood cells, the white blood cells, or the platelets. And then also something called mesenchymal stem cells. We have mesenchymal stem cells. So the mesenchymal stem cells, these have enormous differentiation capacity. They can differentiate into bone, cartilage, muscle, tendon, ligaments, fat cells, connective tissue, and for our discussion, perhaps most importantly, the dermis of the skin. And that's why we have mesenchymal stem cells. So the question, though, is why does this matter? Like, why are we going through all the effort to explain all this? And the answer is because to heal, you must first understand. And if you do understand the principles of cellular differentiation, we can leverage those principles to make ourselves beautiful, to ameliorate scars, and to regrow hair. I've actually done my first stem cell hair treatment. I'm doing my second one tomorrow, so I'm doing it too.
Can it produce more than you were born with?
Yes, it can, believe it or not. So stem cells have the ability to really change the way that we approach wounds. And I want to take a moment and talk about wounds because it's directly related to how we treat scars. There's four stages of wound healing. There is hemostasis, inflammation, proliferation, and remodeling. So hemostasis means blood clotting. So if you cut your finger or what have you, the first thing that happens is the blood clots. And the way that this works is platelets that are flowing through your veins right now, when you have a wound, collagen that's within the blood vessel walls is exposed, and those platelets cling to collagen. And the platelets tack onto that collagen, and it stimulates what's called primary hemostasis, which results in the formation of a platelet plug. And that platelet plug is just like a wine bottle cork. It stems the flow of bleeding. It's extremely important, but it's not very strong. The way the platelet plug is formed is the activation of 13 different proteins, something called the clotting cascade, which if we go into the details is extremely complicated. But short version, platelets get activated by collagen, 13 proteins come together, and it forms a wine bottle cork looking platelet plug. That's primary hemostasis. Secondary hemostasis is that platelet plug is powerful but not strong. And so what happens is fibrin, which is another protein you might have heard of, fibrin comes along, and like a knitting needle, it sews those platelets together, making it a much, much stronger way of stemming the bleeding. Because the reason the body does this so quickly, right? You might remember the last time you cut yourself, it's clotted within a few minutes. Because the body doesn't really care what our wounds look like a year later. Its primary goal is to stem the flow of precious lifeblood and prevent infection that could end our life tomorrow. So the other thing I want to mention about hemostasis and the whole clotting cascade is that it's what's called conserved throughout evolution. So if you it's very interesting. This mechanism is exactly the same in the most primitive forms of life. When a robin pulls an earthworm out of the ground, the clotting cascade that occurs in the earthworm is exactly the same that happens to us if we cut our fingers slicing onions. And that just goes to show that we as people, we as animals, we as organisms are far, far, far more similar than we are different. And one of my favorite scientific facts is something like you and me and a fruit fly were something like 85% identical, and a human and a chimpanzee is something like 99% identical. Just try to understand that for a second. It's mind-blowing. So that leads us into the second stage of wound healing, which is inflammation. So once Once hemostasis has occurred, the housekeeping staff arrives. And so the body essentially sends out a signal from the wound bed to the blood vessels, and it calls in all the white blood cells. Now, the white blood cell is a bit of a generic term. I don't actually know why they call them white. I guess it's because they're not red. So, white blood cells is a generic term for a whole bunch of specialized cells, all of which fight infection. So, the first lineup of the housekeeping staff is called neutrophils, and they arrive within 24 hours. So, the neutrophils essentially kill bacteria and they eat up a whole bunch of dead cells and debris in a process called phagocytosis. That's where they engulf tissue, destroy bacteria, and start to clean out the wound bed. 24 hours later, on day 2 to 3, the reserve troops arrive, and that's called monocytes and macrophages. And so monocytes and macrophages, they continue the cleaning out process, fighting off bacterial and fungal infections, consuming dead debris tissue, but they also kind of put out a call to their friends, and monocytes and macrophages secrete little chemical messengers called inflammatory cytokines. And they go into the bloodstream and they call in really special and important cells called keratinocytes, which go on to form skin cells, fibroblasts, which go on to form collagen, and endothelial cells, which play a role in blood vessel growth and also just the coming together of the wound. So they call in the troops for the next stage of wound healing. So we have hemostasis, we have inflammation, and the third stage of wound healing is called proliferation. And what happens during that time? So proliferation starts on about the third week of a wound. It starts on about the third day and it goes for about 2 weeks. And what happens with this is the body now has to clear out the fibrin clot, and it has to create a mechanism for more wound healing cells to come in and start to repair the wound. So what it does is it creates endothelial cells, which create new blood vessels through a process of angiogenesis. So in the proliferation phase, endothelial cells come in, they get together, they create structures that will become new blood vessels that will enhance wound healing and promote long-term growth. The other thing is they call it epithelial cells, epithelial cells, which create new skin. And so lastly, what guides this? Things like low pH, low oxygen, lactate, all of these chemical messengers in the wound bed orchestrate the independent functions of these various cells. It's quite an elaborate mechanism. The last thing I want to talk about during the third phase of wound healing is fibroblast, because there's more in our skin than just cells. There is something called an extracellular matrix. And so our skin cells are suspended between an incredibly elaborate lattice work of things like proteoglycans, elastin, all of these extracellular components, which are incredibly important. They're essentially like the steel structure of a skyscraper. The extracellular matrix creates an environment that allows our skin cells to do their job. And so part of the process of proliferation is the fibroblasts that create collagen also help to set up the creation of the extracellular matrix. And so that what happens is once the fibroblasts secrete the collagen, it starts to get knitted together to create tightening, to increase the overall strength of a wound. That's why a month after a wound, it still hurts and is quite fragile. A year, it's back to the normal tissue. That cross-linking occurs that brings it all together. And the last and final phase of wound healing is called remodeling, which is by far the longest phase, can go up to as long as 2 years. And what happens during the remodeling phase is the fibroblasts create a very delicate balance between the synthesis of new collagen and the breakdown of old collagen. Over time, you get a net collagen gain, increased thickness, increased strength of the wound. Eventually, the margins close, meaning the whole wound comes together. You get decreased blood flow and you get decreased metabolic activity, restoring it back to the surrounding skin. And so, the last thing I want to talk about is sort of how all of this plays a role in my favorite procedure. One of my favorite things that we do here is scar revision. And so it's very difficult to make scar tissue go back to exactly the original tissue. But what you can do is you can soften it and you can blend it in to kind of help to camouflage it. And so stem cells play a huge role in this, because when you have a scar, if you bring the laser over it, it's kind of like an oil well. That laser beam drills a hole down into the dermis, and so you're creating a wound. That wound is then going to go through the 4 phases: the hemostasis, the inflammation, the proliferation, and the remodeling. And the availability of stem cells to come in, the mesenchymal stem cells, they're going to do 2 things. Number 1, they're going to differentiate into new fibroblasts. So they're going to create new tissue that's going to help to remodel the wound. Also, it sort of helps with the natural progression, because There's two kinds of wounds: acute wounds and chronic wounds. We all know people that have chronic wounds. Diabetics are most famous for it. The wound process of healing, or the healing process of wounds, is good, but it's not perfect. And unfortunately, it's possible for it to get stuck in a certain point, right? And what happens with chronic wounds is it kind of just doesn't quite go according to plan. Often it's because of poor blood flow or because of infection, whatever the reason is. It can get caught in the inflammatory phase and creates an inflammatory loop, and it just never heals. The problem with this is that it's extremely taxing for patients. It's extremely painful. It takes incredible effort to heal the wounds, and it's very, very expensive. So the ability of stem cells to create more fibroblasts, to create more collagen, and also to dial back the inflammation and allow wound healing to go through the 4 phases is valuable, not just for aesthetics, but also for chronic wounds in the medical world. Another way that wound healing can go wrong is it can get caught in the proliferative phase, and this can lead to the collagen formation going off the rails. And so collagen, instead of forming and then being remodeled into a nice smooth wound, it can get caught in a loop where collagen production just keeps going on and on and on, leading to 2 types of scars. One is called hypertrophic, the other is called keloid scars. Now, in the Caucasian population, we don't really keloid. Darker skinned, particularly black skin, does tend to keloid. You also can get it in some Arabs, and you can get it in people from South India sometimes too. But it can be extremely taxing. So a hypertrophic scar is a scar that is bigger than it should be. It's heaped up, kind of like an ice cream cone, but it stays within the border of the scar itself. It's unsightly, but it's not usually a huge problem. And stem cells can help to kind of remodel it back down to a nice flat surface. Keloid scars, which in some people can be extremely disfiguring, are very hard to treat, and you can't surgically remove them because you create another scar that gets worse, not better. So what happens with a keloid scar is it actually extends beyond the wound itself. So if the wound's this big, the keloid scar is this big. And the beauty of stem cells is it can mitigate the inflammation, mitigate the proliferation, and probably do as much as any treatment I'm familiar with to make it better. So how do these stem cells do this? Well, they really do some of the things we've talked about already. They differentiate into fibroblasts, they differentiate into epidermal cells and endothelial cells. And this has 5 main functions that's extremely important for this. It modulates the immune system, like we talked about. It stimulates keratinocytes. Keratinocytes go on to form the outermost layer of skin. They recruit fibroblasts, which create more collagen. They stimulate new blood vessel formation because nothing gets done without blood, right? And not most importantly, but one of the things that stem cells can do is they can differentiate and promote nerve regeneration. Because wounds, the goal is not just to close a hole, it's to restore functional tissue. And the ability to effectively regrow the nerves, the peripheral nerves, plays a huge role in that. So nerve regeneration is not easy, and it takes quite a while, but the mesenchymal stem cells secrete various chemical cytokines, things like BFGF, nerve growth factor, brain natriuretic, what do they call it? Brain natriuretic derived factor. These cellular cytokines help to promote healthy nerve regeneration. So let's switch gears for a second and talk about aesthetics. How can stem cells help us with our aesthetics? Well, we use them in a number of different ways. I often use it to dilute some of our biostimulants like Radiescent Sculptra. It does a great job to enhance the overall effectiveness of the treatment. After a laser procedure, be it a CO2 or a halo laser, the application of stem cells helps to promote healing. It helps to just create an overall enhanced effect. And so there's a lot of roles. But fundamentally, it's quite cruel. We actually start to lose 1% to 2% of our collagen in our late 20s. So by the time you're in your early 40s, you've lost, probably around 30% of your total collagen. It just goes down from there. So anything that will allow us to preserve and enhance collagen production is very, very good for aesthetics. So we lose collagen at an alarming rate. And when you combine that with things like sun damage, natural time, and then also these other molecules that become more prevalent with age, which are called, what they're called oxidants. Matrix metalloproteinases are the name of the enzymes. These conspire together, just overall leading to laxity and to just aged, sort of dry skin. So what happens is it sets up a vicious cycle. The cells that produce collagen, as I've said, are fibroblasts, but fibroblasts are very curious cells. There's a phenomenon in biology called mechanotransduction, which means that the fibroblast, the more that they are physically stretched, the more collagen they produce. So we talked earlier about the extracellular matrix. What happens is the fibroblasts are suspended like a spider in a web by the extracellular matrix. And so as our natural collagen breaks down as the nefarious enzymes matrix metalloproteinases start to erode the extracellular matrix. Oxidation occurs and the whole thing comes crashing down. It's like taking scissors and cutting a spider's web. A spider uses its web to sense its environment, right? The web is taut, and any insect that runs into it triggers the spider and it leaps into action. If the web is cut or if the web is somehow damaged, the spider loses the connection to its external environment and it doesn't really know what's going on. Same idea. As the extracellular matrix degrades, the fibroblasts collapse. Well, the mechanotransduction means that the more the cell is stretched, the more collagen it produces. As it starts to collapse, like letting the air out of a balloon, it sends a signal to the internal mechanism. It starts to create less and less collagen and eventually ceases. So anything that can reconstitute that extracellular matrix and resuspend the fibroblast is going to help us to preserve our collagen. So this is where mesenchymal stem cells come in, because they can differentiate into new fibroblasts. So you get brand new collagen producing cells. They also stimulate, through some of their cellular pathways, they stimulate the production of elastin, which is a component of the extracellular matrix. So you get new fibroblasts and reconstitution of the extracellular matrix. Collectively, these resuspend the fibroblast and collagen production resumes.
Is it targeted to, sorry.
Please, absolutely, sure.
Is it targeted to certain areas, or is that just happening throughout the body when stem cells are introduced?
It's a local effect. That's a great question.
Okay.
So then we talked about doing a laser and maybe putting stem cells on afterwards.
Okay.
So you've created that wound. You're only going to get enhancement where now
Collagen production will happen in that area.
Exactly. So for scar there are people out there who are doing IV stem cells. It's mostly done in South America. Whole other can of worms. You can look it up online. This is way beyond my scope of care, and I think that is probably you're rolling the dice a little bit with that. But locally, it's a great treatment. Okay, and so the last thing I want to talk about is hair loss. And so we will talk about how to regenerate hair, but first let's talk about what hair loss is. Male pattern baldness actually has a name. It's called androgenic alopecia, but it happens to women as well. And in order to understand what happens, you have to talk about the physiology of the hair follicle. So hair comes from the follicle. The follicle is embedded in the dermis. And so hair growth goes through 4 phases. There's the anagen phase, which is the growth phase. There's the catagen phase, which is the transition phase. There's the telogen phase, which is the resting phase. And then there is the exogen phase, which is shedding. And so each and every hair follicle is programmed differently. Each follicle is going through a different phase. So at all times, some of the hair is growing, some of the hair is resting, some of the hair is shedding, right? It's on a clock. That's why with laser hair removal, you have to do 6 sessions, because during those 6 sessions, you're going to catch all the hairs during the growth phase. So in the hair follicle, you have testosterone. All men and all women, we both have testosterone in dramatically different amounts. So in the hair follicle, you have a conversion of testosterone to a much more potent form called dihydrotestosterone. That dihydrotestosterone binds to the androgen receptor in the hair follicle. When that happens, it sets off a whole cellular cascade. The cellular cascade leads to decreased amounts of cyclic AMP, which is a chemical messenger. It leads to decreased sugar in the hair follicle, and more importantly, it leads to decreased energy. As you have decreased energy of the hair follicle, more and more time is spent in the resting phase and less time is spent in the growth phase, which over time leads to thinning and shortening of the hair follicle and hair loss. So understanding that, the introduction of stem cells into the dermis where the hair naturally grows can reactivate hair growth through 2 pathways. Because we're talking about multipotent stem cells, the mesenchymal stem cells can differentiate into new hair follicles. Additionally, they secrete a number of cytokines, and those go in and they wake up the existing hair follicles, causing the conversion from the resting phase, the telogen phase, to the growth phase, the anagen phase. So in a nutshell, you get new hair follicle production and the waking up of old hair follicles that have gone into sort of what's called cellular senescence or decreased activity.
So you can increase your hair volume from menopause and stress.
That's correct. You can. It's typically done as a series of 3, 1 treatment once a month for 3 months. And you're going to see maximum benefit probably about 4 to 6 months after the last treatment, because the differentiation does take a little time. But yes, so that's a great setup for our conclusion, which is If we think about the great famous Irish author George Bernard Shaw, the Nobel laureate and the author of My Fair Lady, George Bernard Shaw has a quotation which is that youth is wasted on the young. And while that might have been true, I say it is no more, because stem cells empower us to combine the power of youth with the wisdom of age. Thank you very much.